As is so often the case, our view of history depends on our own cultural context and perspective. For many nations, the years following the carnage of the First World War and the horror of the Second represent a period of peace. Yes, there was a gathering storm in Germany with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the growing supremacy of the Nazi Party, but there was no out-and-out conflict, at least not yet. But this isn't everyone's experience. For Spanish, Irish, and Russian people, these so-called interwar years were times of bitter civil conflict and internal strife that would leave lasting scars. For Poles, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, and Moroccans, there were struggles for independence, liberation, and self-determination. From an Ethiopian perspective, or from a Chinese one, this was a time of invasion and bloody subjugation. Whether you class these struggles as continuations of the First World War, or preludes to the Second Global Conflict, or as something else, the facts are the same. This was peacetime in name only. But even in regions largely untouched by the far-reaching influence of global conflict, brutal wars erupted. Between 1932 and 1935, Bolivia and Paraguay waged a devastating territorial conflict known as the Chaco War, a series of clashes that are largely forgotten in other nations, whose attentions lay very much elsewhere during this period, but which retain a tragic legacy in this part of the world. This was a war fought between largely Spanish-speaking peoples with the involvement of German and Russian generals, but this was not a European conflict at all, and was instead wholly a South American one. Join us on this episode of Uncharted Latin America as we get to grips with the Chaco War, examining how, for 3 years in the 1930s, all-out conflict unfolded across an unforgiving landscape, leaving 100,000 bodies in its wake. Neither Bolivia nor Paraguay were strangers to armed conflict or to major defeats. Paraguay fought the disastrous War of the Triple Alliance in the 1860s, taking on Brazil first, and then her allies Argentina and Uruguay, in a struggle that reduced Paraguay's population by half. In the 1870s and 80s, Bolivia lost its entire coastline after a taxation dispute with Chile spilled over into the War of the Pacific, leaving the nation politically and geographically isolated and struggling economically. But this was a new century. The conflicts of the decades before were still within living memory, but had become the fabric of a bygone age, something to be forgotten and moved on from rather than dwelled upon. Unfortunately, forgetting the sting of past defeats also meant forgetting the terrible human and economic toll of these military disasters. Both landlocked and surrounded by more powerful neighbors, Bolivia and Paraguay looked for new ways to expand their territory and focus their attention on each other. The vast estuary of the Rio de la Plata, the River Plate or River of Silver, is associated heavily with Argentina, but in fact, its northern coastline is Uruguayan territory and its drainage basin covers an enormous area of South America's central lands. Rivers that rise in Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and crucially Bolivia and Paraguay meet the Atlantic Ocean here. Bolivia, still struggling after the loss of its coastline in the west some 50 years before, saw the Rio de la Plata system as a lifeline that could connect the country to the Atlantic in the southeast and then to the world. It's worth bearing in mind that Bolivia is a long way from the Atlantic Ocean. It seems unlikely that Bolivia wanted to force a corridor to the southeast in search of a new coastline. This would have meant fighting through Argentina and Brazil too, most likely a suicide mission. Instead, by controlling the northern section of Paraguay, the Chaco Boreal, they could gain access to the Rio Paraguay, and from there the Rio de la Plata and the Atlantic. Even a relatively small territorial gain could result in real economic benefits. There were the other potential economic benefits too, chiefly oil. The discovery of oil in Bolivia had bolstered the country's economy, and this find gave the government reason to believe there was oil in the Chaco Boreal too. Of course, while the presence of oil was not confirmed, it put the territory on the radar of the Paraguayan armed forces too. For both sides, the idea of controlling and then developing an oil-rich province was an exciting one. But plenty of countries covet the territory of their neighbors. This isn't necessarily a pretext for war. So, who actually owned Chaco Boreal in those early decades of the 20th century? The official answer is simple: Paraguay controlled the territory. The true answer, however, is a little more complex. The borders of the Chaco Boreal were not well defined, and certainly were not mutually agreed upon. The area is inhospitable and unsuitable for habitation, and so Paraguay hadn't really settled the land beyond a few outposts and some civilian infrastructure. Paraguay had built fortifications in the region, but these were small and poorly equipped. The two sides had clashed over Chaco Boreal in the past, with little to no change in policy or status, but this time it was Bolivia, with its superior manpower and equipment, that felt confident of victory. Bolivia was on the march. The country's vast mineral resources, Bolivian tin, silver and oil flowing across international markets, meant it had the money required to wage a modern war. It had the people too, 3 million of them, compared to the Paraguayan population of only 900,000. In 1926, the Bolivian government took out a contract with the Vickers in the UK, and the nation's armed forces were bolstered with machine guns and artillery pieces that were shipped across the Atlantic to South America. And it's not just guns, vehicles too. Vickers provided Vespa and Type 143 fighter planes, along with Carden Lloyd tanks. Bolivia was armed, ready for a fight. Paraguay understood what they needed to do. They had resources too, but the palm oil and leather that propped up their economy couldn't quite match up to the tin and silver mines of their neighbors. And so the Paraguayan government stretched its coffers to the max as it sought to keep pace. Reaching out to backers and partners in Europe and North America, Paraguay was able to scrabble together an impressive set of armaments, including rifles from Spain, machine guns from Denmark and the United States, and field guns and warplanes from France. They were also studying hard. Advisors from France helped train Paraguayan troops, while the army's generals and officers examined modern tactics from the First World War as they readied themselves for the conflict to come. Homegrown assets also proved valuable. In José Félix Estigarribia, Paraguay had an expert commander, and the brilliance of Estigarribia's officer corps would also make itself known as the war unfolded. On December 5th, 1928, it was Paraguay that struck first, turning a military build-up into an active conflict zone. At this early stage, neither side was prepared to commit all-out conflict, so both Bolivia and Paraguay skirmished, probed, and maneuvered around the inhospitable Chaco barrens while continuing to develop their armed forces. By June of 1932, 3.5 years after those initial clashes, Bolivia had 6,000 men stationed in the Chaco Boreal. They were ready. The Paraguayan fortification at Lake Pichuantuta was their target, and they moved on this the same month, occupying the outpost. Paraguayan troops returned in July and retook Lake Pichuantuta before the Bolivian forces took the villages of Corrales and Toledo on July 27th and 28th. Next on the Bolivian agenda was Baqueron, a Paraguayan fortress that was heavily defended. Now Bolivia's armies would show what they were made of. Fighter and bomber aircraft swooped in along with the infantry, chipping away at the stiff Paraguayan resistance, and the fort fell before the month was out. The first phase of Bolivia's operation had been successful. Now, they assumed they would simply continue their march toward the Rio Paraguay, having given their enemies a bloody nose and shown the Paraguayans who was boss. This was a remarkably naive assumption. Paraguay hadn't been building up its military for nothing. If Bolivia wanted a fight, Bolivia would have a fight. Paraguay responded with massive mobilization, including large swaths of its reserve force. At Isla Poi, a settlement to the south of Lake Pichuantuta in central Chaco Boreal, an army corps of 8,000 men appeared, ready to resist further Bolivian incursion. Further south still, at Nanawa, 1,500 men began constructing defensive positions, while the Paraguayans placed a division of 3,000 men and 8 field guns along the Bolivian objective, the Rio Paraguay. The Bolivian command now faced a conundrum. If they advanced too quickly, they risked being cut off from their resupply lines, which were becoming increasingly stretched. If, on the other hand, they advanced too slowly, the offensive would stall and the Paraguayan forces may take the initiative. So began the first of many death marches for Bolivian troops during the Chaco War. As reinforcements were mobilized in the high mountains of central and western Bolivia, they were brought to the Chaco by rail, but only as far as Villamontes in southern Bolivia. From here, it was an overland march to the front, somewhere between 200 and 300 miles to the east. Horses were no good. They weakened and perished in the brutal plains of the Chaco Boreal. Trucks were perfect, but these were reserved for ammunition and supplies. The men themselves had to walk, often succumbing to exhaustion, disease, and snake bites before they even reached the front lines. It was a similar story for the Paraguayans, but different in one crucial detail. Isla Poy, by now the main Paraguayan base, lay only 18 miles from the end of the country's rail network. Paraguay lost men to exhaustion and to disease too, but nothing like the losses of the Bolivians on their brutal cross-country marches. By September 1932, Estigarribia had a plan to shatter the Bolivians. His first corps would capture the garrison at Boqueron, taking 1,000 Bolivian prisoners. His calculations proved a little on the optimistic side, and the corps failed to take the garrison. It did, however, place the Bolivians under siege. A relief column moving in from the west ran right into the Paraguayans and was annihilated in one of the bloodiest encounters in those early months of the war. The Bolivian Air Force struggled to keep the defenders resupplied, often dropping their cargoes chaotically and inaccurately from high altitudes under withering Paraguayan machine gun fire. Eventually, the Bolivians at Boqueron had had enough. They surrendered, giving the government in La Paz a rude awakening as to the way the war was going to be. Eusebio Ayala's government in Asunción had its first great victory of the war, but this had come at a terrible cost. Until 1930, General Hans Kundt, a German World War I veteran, had been key to the organization of the Bolivian armed forces. However, after the 1930 coup ousted President Hernando Reyes, Kundt was exiled. After the defeat at Boqueron, it didn't take long for the Bolivian government to realize they needed Kundt on their side. Before 1932 was out, the German general was back in the country, returned and rehabilitated on a wave of popular support and military necessity. The newly emboldened Bolivian forces first launched a frontal assault on the Paraguayan lines, driving them back into the Chaco. From here, Kundt turned his attention to the south of the region, developing a plan to attack Nanawa, control the southern Chaco, and put the Paraguayan capital of Asunción under threat. In January 1933, the attack was launched. Kundt was confident, declaring that the war would be finished in 3 months and boasting that he expected to be on time for an engagement he had scheduled in Berlin that April. But the Paraguayan forces were well briefed. Their intelligence was strong, and they knew with a high degree of precision where and when the Bolivian attack would come. They also had their own European assistance in the form of exiled Tsarist Russian officers, including General Ivan Bilayev. Once again, the Bolivian attack fell apart and losses were significant. Estigarribia and his Paraguayan forces had themselves another victory, although they too suffered casualties they could ill afford. Kundt was not happy. April came and went, with Bolivia's forces still struggling in the Chaco, and Kundt did not make it back to Berlin. If he'd been humiliated in the January offensive, he did not allow this to shake his confidence. Instead, he made plans for much larger action, one that drew upon the frightening power of Bolivian military technology. At the beginning of July 1933, Bolivian artillery pieces let fly, hammering the Paraguayan positions around Nanawa. This enormous barrage was intended to soften up the bunker complexes and defensive structures of the Paraguayan forces and provide cover for the Bolivian infantry advance. Ultimately, it achieved neither. The artillery shells did very little damage to the bunkers, and Paraguay's intelligence meant they already knew where the infantry was and what its movements would be. Again, a network of machine gun emplacements, supported by mobile mortar teams, decimated the advancing troops. But Kundt had an ace up his sleeve, his Vickers tank force. A handful of the mechanized beasts lumbered across the scrubland, with flamethrower units backing up their advance. The psychological effect of the modern war machines quickly evaporated, however, as the tank tracks became choked in the thick, thorny brush of the Chaco plain, bringing two of the vehicles to a halt. Another was knocked out by a Paraguayan heavy gun that shattered the Caterpillar tracks and rendered it immobile. Still, Kundt was undeterred. He ordered another assault, and another, and more over the next 3 days as Paraguayan forces repelled attack after attack. The bloody attritional campaign at Nanawa left 2,000 Bolivians dead on the broad expanse of the southern Chaco Boreal, more than 10 times the number of Paraguayans dead. Estigarrabia's defense had been strong up to now, but to win the war, he'd have to take the fight to his enemy. Enter Colonel Rafael Franco. It wasn't only Kundt who had been ousted and then rehabilitated after political turmoil. Franco had been fired from the Paraguayan military because of his political affiliations, but the talented commander was very much back in the fold by the summer of 1933 and was the head of the 1st Division. Franco's tactics were long range, comprised of probing assaults that dove deep into Bolivian-held territory. This was a far cry from the frontal, human wave assaults of their enemy. At Alihuata on July 12th, Franco and his men smashed the Bolivian 4th Division and scattered the survivors into the hurried retreat. For the Bolivian government, Kundt was still the man for the job, but his officers disagreed. They'd seen the sickening losses firsthand, and they'd witnessed the rigid and inflexible nature of the German general's tactics. Estigarribia had seen them too. He knew that Kundt would not permit his men to give up ground, which meant a smaller, yet more maneuverable Paraguayan force could easily isolate Bolivian units in the field. Estigarribia just needed to pick his target, and he could bring total victory within Paraguay's grasp. At Campo Vía, a target was found. Here, the Bolivian lines were fractured, and advanced Paraguayan units could surge through and encircle the unsuspecting enemy positions. Colonel Franco and the 1st Division would be among the vanguard, pushing deep into Bolivian territory and cutting off the enemy from the rear. Rejecting intelligence he received from aerial reconnaissance and thoroughly upbraiding any officer who suggested a fallback, Kundt ordered his units to remain in the line. As a result, his 4th and 9th Divisions became trapped by the swift Paraguayan action. An attempt to rescue these divisions turned into a bizarre and catastrophic mess when Bolivian planes bombed their own men, and the 4th and 9th surrendered on December 11th, while the remaining divisions fell back westwards toward the frontier. Paraguay now not only had thousands of Bolivian prisoners, but also rifles, ammunition, artillery pieces, and motor vehicles captured from the encircled positions. Back in La Paz, President Daniel Salamanca finally ran out of patience, sacking Kundt and placing Enrique Peñaranda in charge of the armed forces. While the Paraguayan troops felt victory was within their grasp, the High Command urged for calm. Pursuing the fleeing Bolivians would mean stretching supply lines to a breaking point, so the advance units were called back in the hope that Bolivia would now be desperate for peace. That peace did not come. With the new commander, the Bolivians rallied, developing a new defensive line and scoring a significant victory against the Paraguayan 8th Division at Cañada's strongest. The thrill of victory was short-lived. Soon, Paraguay was back on the front foot, advancing further into the western Chaco. This advance was halted in July of 1934, but another audacious and expertly planned flanking and encirclement action at El Carmen in November of the same year wiped out the Bolivian Reserve Corps. A quarter of the corps was killed and half were taken prisoner. El Carmen was a military disaster for Bolivia and a political one too. General Peñaranda felt his neck was on the line, so he struck first against the presidency. While visiting the troops at their Villamontes base, President Salamanca was captured by Peñaranda and his officers, while the garrison at La Paz staged a coup d'etat in the general's favor. Vice President José Luis Tejada Sorzano took over as the leader of Bolivia. Peñaranda may have kept his job, but his position was an unenviable one. Bolivian forces had now fallen back to within the nation's pre-war borders, mounting a defense at Villamontes. In April of 1935, Paraguay began an incursion into Bolivia itself, but they were pushed back across the Parapiti River. Paraguay had achieved a victory of sorts in the brutal conditions of the Chaco, but fighting and an ongoing action in Bolivia would be very different indeed. By now, both sides were exhausted. Colonel Bernardino Bilbao Rioja was performing admirably in the defense of Villamontes, but no one in the Bolivian side still believed a military victory in the Chaco was possible. Paraguay, which had punched above its weight up to now, was feeling the pinch too. Its supply lines were overstretched and struggling, while the Paraguayan troops grew weary of the bloodshed. On June 14th, the Chaco War ended, 3 years after it began. Bolivia recognized the Paraguayan claim to the Chaco region, while Paraguay, eager to bring an end to hostilities, granted their neighbors access to the Rio Paraguay as well as a valuable port along the river. The Chaco War was fought in locations across the arid and desolate plains of northern Paraguay, but was concentrated around the southern reaches of this forbidding land. In the scrub and brush of the Chaco, some 60,000 Bolivians lost their lives, while 31,500 Paraguayans fell in its defense. For every 5 men Paraguay called up, 1 would perish in the war. More than a quarter of the mobilized Bolivians lost their lives. Few 20th century conflicts can match this kind of bloodshed. There were lessons to be learned here. Bolivia naively assumed the weight of their economic prowess, technological might, and sheer numbers of men would win the day. From the outset, they employed the attritional tactics seen on the battlefields of Europe 20 years earlier, as bloody advances yielded almost no advantage. Paraguay, on the other hand, was forced to be wily and smart as it outboxed the invaders, making up for what resources it lacked with superior tactics. By flanking and encircling its opponents and by utilizing intelligence and mobility on the battlefield, Paraguay essentially claimed victory in the conflict, although the war would prove to be a dark chapter in the histories of both countries. Outside of South America, the Chaco War is largely forgotten, a tragic footnote between the First and Second World Wars. Even more tragic is that the lessons of this conflict were discarded almost entirely. 4 years after the bloodshed in the Chaco Boreal, the storm of war would be unleashed anew across Europe and the Pacific, and humanity would once again be faced with senseless loss of life on a devastating scale. What do you think? Could lessons have been learned from this bloody conflict, or is the Chaco War just another grim entry to the roll call of international bloodshed and senseless slaughter? Let us know in the comments section below, and thank you for joining us in this journey into uncharted Latin America.